this little video, I'm going to be trying to give you an introduction to some of the thought of Albert Camus and some of the philosophical and historical background of his novel, The Plague, to help you understand your reading and discussion of it. You can find the slides for this video as well as some links to resources at dbannock.com/plague. So Albert Camus was born in 1913 and died in a car crash in 1960. He was born a French colonial in North Africa, in Algiers, in Algeria. As you can see, Algiers is on a little narrow slice of green in between the sea and the desert. This, we think, is the room in which Albert Camus grew up, in the poor Arab section, or Casbah, of Algiers. And you can see that Algiers is a physically beautiful city. You would contrast this later with Oran, in which the plague is set. Oran, he said, was the city that turned its back on the sea and represented sort of a modern technological European city, one that was run on European principles. So The Plague is an allegorical novel. It's literally about a pandemic like the one that we've just been through. But it has at least three allegorical meanings, which Albert Camus had spelled out. One is the Nazi occupation of France. The Plague's first drafts were circulated by Camus, who was an editor of the resistance newspaper Combat, and was circulated among the resistance fighters during the Nazi occupation of France, and is meant to describe the situation of people trapped and isolated in Paris and its surroundings during the Nazi occupation. It's also meant to represent a particular type of illness or moral illness or malaise of 20th century European culture. The problem that's sometimes called nihilism or nothingism. Camus thinks and wants to explain the fact that the most Christian and the most scientifically advanced culture that's ever existed on this planet is also a culture which murdered 60 million Jews and who demonstrated the fact that they did not believe in the Christian or Enlightenment values that founded their culture when the Nazis marched into their towns and asked them to comply with their system of murder. And lastly, the plague is going to represent the basic human condition, which Albert Camus and existentialism believes is a type of alienation or separation, a type of absurdity, which we'll talk about. So we're going to want to keep in mind each of those three different allegorical meanings of the plague. So literally, the story is about an outbreak of the Bubonic Plague in northern Africa. The Bubonic Plague was a particularly painful and deadly illness that involved swellings in the groin and armpits, which you'll hear described. And it was caused by infected fleas from rats. And it was more or less eradicated in the modern world in the 1930s through antibiotics and the control of rats. And Camus chooses to use it as a representative of some of the themes that he wanted to talk about. The plague is part of a project that is in the second stage of the works of Albert Camus. He became famous, first of all, during the First World War, or during the Second World War, for the publication of two works, The Stranger, and The Myth of Sisyphus, a series of essays that were published during the Nazi occupation of France during the Second World War. And The Plague goes along with a series of essays called The Rebel, and they're both part of an attempt to respond to some of the problems that arose from the theories that arose in this first set of works. And they're both published in the aftermath of the Second World War, and as part of an ongoing dispute with another French philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre. After the publication of The Plague and the Rebel, Albert Camus will receive a Nobel Prize in literature, mostly for work in this third stage, a novel called The Fall and a series of short stories called Exile in the Kingdom. Existentialism is a sort of a nebulous philosophical viewpoint. Hardly anyone actually claimed the term existentialism as a description of their beliefs, apart from Jean-Paul Sartre, the compatriot and contemporary of Albert Camus, who fought along with him in the French resistance against the Nazis. It arose among a series of Christian thinkers trying to get clear about the meaning of Christianity. And it was formulated in the 20th century mostly by atheistic philosophers like Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Albert Camus. Its basic ideas are that human beings are trapped within the standpoint of human existence, trapped within their experience and their mind, cut off from God and the world and other people. And because of that, they have a radical freedom to choose their own meaning and to choose their own lives in ways that aren't defined by anything outside of them. And their happiness depends upon seeing clearly and confronting death and authentically living their lives in accordance with their free choices. We'll see that Camus denied being an existentialist, and The Plague is one of the first works in which he tried to articulate some ideas that went beyond the existentialism of his early works, The Stranger and The Myth of Sisyphus, which continue to be seen as particularly clear expressions of the basic ideas of what's called existentialism. And one of those key ideas is the idea of the absurd. It is the meaning of that third, most general allegorical meaning of the plague. The idea that there's a disconnect between us and our world, so that we experience our position in the world as one of alienation and contradiction and absurdity. And we'll see that the absurd means a disparity between our desire for there to be a God and morality and clarity, and the fact that the world and death and the recurring appearance of the plague continues to frustrate those ambitions. The fundamental representation of the absurd is repetition. Camus uses the story of Sisyphus, who was condemned by the gods to endlessly roll a ball up to the top of the hill, only to see it roll back down again, endlessly and eternally struggling to get the ball up to the top of the hill, knowing that he could never complete that task. You'll read in The Plague, Rieux, the main character, just saying that that's what the plague is, the repetition of the same thing over and over and over again, without hope of victory, without hope of end. And of course, that repetition, that meaningless repetition of those acts is supposed to represent our modern alienated technological life. Getting up in the morning, going to work, watching TV, going to bed, getting up in the morning, going to work, watching TV, going to bed, and over again until we die. You'll want to pay attention in the plague, especially to that first section where Tarrou's journal is describing the type of boredom that's endemic to Oran. He chose that city as a setting for the play because he thought it represented in some way the type of boredom and the type of absurdity and alienation that is endemic to the modern technological world. And you may want to think about how our pandemic revealed certain things, similar features about our world. You'll want to pay attention to the characters in the beginning, like the man who plays with the cats, or the asthma patient counting time out by passing peas from one bowl to the other, as examples of the absurd in the beginning of the plague. But all of the particular events in the plague are always going to be set against this most fundamental background of absurdity. What can be the point of human life if we're trapped within the standpoint of existence and we have to choose our own meaning? in the face of our ultimate death. So in the first stage of Camus' work, the stranger asks the question, once we face the absurd, once we face the fact that we can't get in touch with any God, God isn't present to us, and all of us are going to die. Is there any reason not to kill? And the myth of Sisyphus is going to ask what Camus would say is the fundamental philosophical question. Should one kill oneself as a consequence of the absurd? And Camus in the Myth of Sisyphus is going to say that one must imagine Sisyphus happy, that neither murder nor suicide are the logical consequence of the absurd, that it's possible to choose your own value and your own meaning from the inside and resist the nihilism, the nothingness, or the feeling of absurdity that's endemic to the modern life in which is part of the plague. And the second meaning of the plague, remember, was the illness that led Europe to the murderous world of the Second World War and the Holocaust. And Camus would say that the fundamental question of the modern world of the 20th century is, do you want to be a victim or an executioner? Do you want to be a murderer or a victim of murder? So the fundamental idea of existentialism was that we don't have an essence or a nature that comes to us from God. Instead, that existence precedes essence. We're thrown into existence without a nature and are condemned to choose freely our own nature, despite the fact that our culture and our surroundings always aim at hiding our freedom from ourselves and getting us to deny it and hide it from ourselves. So the basic idea of existentialism is that you're completely free. You're an absolute individual tied up within your own existence, within your own mind, free to create your own identity and your own values and your own meaning to your life. Camus then is going to try to solve in the plague the problem that arose from the stranger and the myth of Sisyphus. Why, if you're an absolute individual, what reason do you have to care about other people? What reason do you have to form a community? And in particular, we'll see, what reason do you have to continue to fight against the plague? And it's that problem that he's going to be trying to solve in the novel. And the novel tells the story of about a year of the plague in the city of Oran, which is put under quarantine, its citizens trapped and suffering from the plague, who then are faced with the question of how they are going to react to that situation. Are they going to be out for themselves and fight only for their own pleasure and their own happiness? Or can they find some reason to band together and help the community and to recover a sense of connection? So there's probably not any of the works that we're looking at that ask the question about the community, individual, and the divine more directly. Is there any reason outside of the divine to form a community? Is there any reason to resist our individual urges and our individual freedom and to restrain it in order to form a community? So there are three main characters, apart from the main character, our narrator, Dr. Bernard Rieux, who you're going to want to pay attention to. And there are going to be three big debates which I want to direct your attention towards. And those are Tarrou, who represents probably most purely the existential standpoint of someone who doesn't believe in God, trying to find a reason to act morally and to be a saint, Tarrou will say. There's going to be Rambert, who is a lover and wants to escape the plague quarantine town to reunite with his loved one. And there will be Father Paneloux, the religious figure, who will struggle to make sense of the suffering caused of the plague. There will be a couple other characters, Joseph Grand and Cottard, who will represent different themes in about the problem of the absurd and nihilism, as we'll see. So we're going to want to pay attention to, or I want to direct your attention to three of the big debates between Rieux and Tarrou about why to fight the plague if there is no God, between Rambert and Rieux about whether love is more important than the common good, and between Paneloux and Rieux about the meaning of human suffering. So the first dialogue, and you can see I have the page numbers here that you can find on the slides if you want to find the particular passages you should pay attention to, is between Rieux and Tarrou, when Tarrou asked Rieux directly, why do you continue to fight against the plague if you don't believe in God? And Rieux responds with one of Camus' most basic arguments that he gets from the Russian philosopher Dostoevsky, the Russian novelist, that no one, a part of our plague in the second sense, the illness of modern culture, is that no one really believes in the fundamental principles of religion that were taken as second nature during the Middle Ages. And in the modern world, everyone pays lip service to them in a fake way and doesn't actually believe them. So Rieux and Tarrou are struggling with the question of nihilism, and that was stated most clearly by the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky, who asked, if there is no God, is all permitted? Does nothing matter? Is nothing unlawful or nothing immoral if there is no God? And Camus would ask the very same question in his Myth of Sisyphus when he said that no code of ethics and no effort are justifiable in the face of the cruel mathematics of death that commands our condition. And there's a simple response that Camus gives to this problem. And it's one that will inform the solutions that he proposed, that Camus was going to be arguing for in each of these dialogues. And it's sort of encapsulated in the idea that it's impossible to stop caring, that the very reasons why suffering in the plague would make us want to stop caring are also reasons that are reinforced that we should care. So think for a second, if we believe that nothing matters, if there is no God and death ends everything, and we believe that nothing matters, then does it matter that nothing matters? I'll say it again. If nothing matters, then does it matter that nothing matters? It seems that the obvious answer would be no. So the fact that we find ourselves reacting to the absurd, rebelling against it, the fact that we rebel against the plague and against suffering, shows for Camus, and this is an argument he again got from Dostoevsky, that indeed it does matter to us, that we do care about those things. So what you should be looking for in these dialogues are reasons to continue to care and fight the plague, despite the fact that it means a never-ending defeat, and despite the fact that there may not be any eternal reason to do so, and the way in which Camus will try to point out how all of us really have a seed of caring within us that we can not deny without succumbing to the plague. So pay attention to the central passages around 161 to 172, where Rieux articulates his answer to the problem of nihilism, saying his code of ethics is comprehension or human decency. Ask yourself what that could mean. And Tarrou, there'll be an important passage in the part 5 of the novel where Tarrou will describe what actually happened to Camus when he was a young man, taken by his father to witness an execution. Tarrou will provide the best account of that second meaning of the plague by saying that all Western Europeans are complicit with murder by their complicity in the death penalty in capital punishment. And of course, we'll see that could have been written today to talk about the way all of us are complicit in systemic racism and how our pandemic revealed to us the plague or the moral sickness or the complicity that afflicted our culture. So you'll want to pay attention to that passage of Tarrou's on capital punishment and see how it relates to the way in which Black Lives Matter arose within our plague. A couple minor characters are related to this dialogue as well. Joseph Grand was thought by Camus to be the absurd hero who, like Sisyphus, continued to struggle and found that the value of his life was in the struggle itself towards the heights and not in the end result, when he continued to try to find the right words and finish his novel despite the fact that he never got past the first line. And Cottard will be a type that Camus thought represented the people who gave in and collaborated with the Nazis, and who he'll explore in much more detail in his later work in The Fall and in his adaptation of Dostoevsky's novel The Possessed. You may want to ask yourself what types of collaborators or moral failures were revealed during the pandemic. What was the psychology behind them? As you'll want to ask, what's the psychology between Cottard's glee at the appearance of the plague? The second dialogue may be equally important and may be the more fundamental one for the entire novel. And that's the one between love and duty. Rambert wants to follow love and find a way to escape the city. And eventually he'll give in and continue to fight against the plague, despite his desire to fulfill his individual love and goals. And for Camus, this is the debate between abstract ideals and the individual value of particular lives. You want to pay attention during the plague to the different types of failures of love. Um, Rambert and his lover are separated. Rieux and his wife are separated. All of us, in some way, are separated from every other human being. Why should we continue to care and to love other people is one of the themes. And behind this little debate between Rieux and Rambert about what's more important, the common good or individual love, is a debate between Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, the other main French existentialist, after the Second World War. They had a falling out over a number of different issues. They disagreed about whether the collaborators, people who had worked with the Nazis, should be executed. They disagreed about Sartre's support of Joseph Stalin and communism, despite the fact that it became obvious that Stalin was moving and causing the deaths of millions of people in work camps. And particularly, their disagreement about French participation and struggle against Algerian rebels who were trying to get their independence of French colonial rule. We'll see the fruits of that when we see another struggle against the people who won that battle in the uh, film that we watched about the monks who were in the middle of this second rebellion. But Camus had argued against sacrificing individuals and submitting to murder or terror in order to get abstract goods or to get a perfect utopian world in the future. He would say to journalists when he accepted the Nobel Prize, when he saw that the Algerian rebels were using terrorist bombs against civilians, that his mother could have been on one of those trams. And if he has to choose between abstract justice and my mother, he would choose his mother. And in some sense, you'll want to pay attention to the solution to that problem at the end, when we find that only the people who aspired to love sometimes entered into their reward at the very end of the novel, and that those who had pursued abstractions, like Dr. Rieux, were left unsatisfied. Rieux would say, you have to have a little bit of the plague inside you. You have to become an abstraction to fight the plague. And he found himself hardening his heart and having to act on those abstract rules, even when it meant dragging people away, kicking and screaming from their loved ones. Of course, we found lots of examples of that during our current pandemic. The third big dialogue that you want to pay attention to is between Paneloux, the priest, and Rieux. And it's based upon another passage from Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov. Paneloux and Rieux are forced to watch the awful scene of the suffering of Monsieur Magistrate Athon's son, an innocent little child. And Rieux will react against that powerfully, and despite the priest's attempt to get him to accept what he can't understand, why children should suffer, he'll say, as the character in The Brothers Karamazov will say, that he can't accept any happiness, any abstract utopia, or any higher harmony that exists from God beyond this world if the cost of it is the suffering of innocent children. And in this case, this is less an argument against the existence of God than it is a way of trying to understand the different responses to suffering that religion and existentialism give. And ultimately, it will result in a type of allyship or cooperation between Paneloux and Rieux, despite besides the priest's second sermon, where he says that you either have to accept everything or deny everything, the argument he calls the all or the nothing. He thinks that if we accept nihilism, then nothing will matter and we'll have no reason for living. Therefore, one should accept all of that suffering. Camus had called that philosophical suicide. He had called that giving up, stopping caring about the values of the standpoint of existence. And ultimately, he finds that Paneloux agrees with him. Paneloux agrees to work with him. And even though he tries to live true to his beliefs and to not take the serum for the plague and allow himself to die from the plague, till his dying day, he also struggled against suffering and struggled against torture. About the same time, Camus had been meeting with some monks in a Dominican monastery and gave other speeches later in his life that tried to talk about the way in which Christians and atheists or secular people could both join together in their fight against suffering and their struggle to make the world a better place. You may want to think about the meaning of that phrase, even God can't part us now, which has two clever meanings. See if you can puzzle out what it means to say that even God can't part us now, when Paneloux and Rieux, in the face of that suffering, decide that they're really fighting on the same side of things. So hopefully, concentrating on those three main dialogues will help you make sense of this wonderful and complex novel. Remember, there are three big questions you should think of. If there is no God, is there any reason to help your fellow human being? What reason and what basis for community can we have? Then second of all, you'll want to think about what plague or moral illness our pandemic revealed in us, similar to the way in which the Nazis marching into France forced people with decisions that caused the rats to appear and recognize that we were fake or phony in our commitment to the values of Christianity and the Enlightenment. What abstractions have arisen that ignore the values of individuals as we fought against the pandemic, and what conflicts between the common good and the individual arose in our experience of the last 2 years. And last of all, you'll want to think about how is it possible not to succumb to the plague and to death and to not lose hope and despair. And you'll want to ask, is it really true that there can be a community in which religious and secular people work together for a common good? Are we really both aiming at the same good, at somehow curing the plague and fighting human suffering, despite the fact that the plague will always arise and send its rats out upon the innocent city that waits for it? So have a good seminars, and I hope you enjoy the book.